During the frigid winter of 1887, a crew tasked with restoring the foundation of an abandoned Catholic orphanage deep in the Pennsylvania countryside stumbled upon something that would haunt them forever as they worked beneath what was once the dining hall. They pried up old floorboards and uncovered a chilling sight: 93 small wooden crosses, each one bearing a child's name and a date ranging from 1834 to 1851. The number alone was unsettling, but what made the discovery even more disturbing was that, according to archived church documents, the orphanage known as Santa Ulia had taken in exactly 93 children throughout its 17 years of existence. Shaken by what they'd found, the workers contacted local authorities. But before any formal inquiry could take place, officials from the Diocese of Philadelphia abruptly arrived at the scene. They quickly seized the crosses and any other potential evidence, claiming the materials were sensitive and belonged to the church. The renovation came to an abrupt stop. Within a matter of days, the building was razed to the ground, and the crew was paid generously under the condition that they would never speak of what they had discovered. For more than a century, Santa Ulia faded into obscurity, its story reduced to whispers and second-hand rumors. But recently unearthed letters and first-hand accounts have brought to light a history so unsettling that it forces us to reconsider what we thought we knew about the role of religious charity in 19th century America. This is not a tale for the faint-hearted. The events surrounding Santa Ulia reach deep into the shadows cast by faith and power, exposing the darkness that can fester behind sanctified walls. If you're someone who dares to confront the hidden truths buried in America's religious past, you're in the right place. The questions surrounding Santa Ulia demand answers, and only the bold will seek them. If you're still with us, we invite you to share where you're listening from in the comments, and prepare yourself for a story that religious institutions have spent generations trying to erase. Our journey begins in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, small town nestled among the rolling hills of Lancaster County. Back in the 1830s, Millbrook was home to just a few hundred residents, most of them descendants of German settlers, predominantly Lutheran or members of the Reformed Church. Catholicism had only recently gained a foothold in the area, brought in by Irish workers who had remained in town. After helping to build the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1832, Millbrook was a place where life moved to the sound of church bells, and everyone knew everyone else. But amid the routines of daily life, the sight of orphan children wandering the streets served as a painful reminder of the unforgiving nature of industrial progress. It was during this time that a man named Father Heinrich Kellerman emerged as a figure of growing influence. Father Kellerman, a strict and imposing priest from Bavaria with a commanding presence and steely blue eyes, had arrived in 1833 determined to plant Catholic roots. In the heart of Protestant Pennsylvania, educated in Munich and gifted with both intellectual depth and a fierce sense of purpose, he envisioned more than just a church. He aimed to create a center that would address both the spiritual and social needs of the Catholic minority. The idea for the orphanage came to him during a brutal winter, when he saw several young children sleeping in the cold, exposed and starving. Moved or perhaps inspired by the opportunity to elevate the Catholic Church's reputation among the skeptical locals, he launched an ambitious plan. By appealing to wealthy Catholic donors in Philadelphia, he quickly secured the funds needed to purchase an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, once owned by a failed textile merchant. The building was large and dignified, with 3 floors, tall windows, and a grand wraparound porch. Residents of Millbrook watched with wary interest as the mansion was transformed. Under Father Kellerman's direction, it became more than just a shelter. It was reshaped into a symbol of Catholic benevolence. He hired local craftsmen to construct a small chapel in the eastern wing, turned parlors into communal sleeping quarters, and added a kitchen and dining area in a detached structure. But it was the final addition, the one that loomed above them all, that truly set the building apart. A tall bell tower pierced the sky above the building's center, its bronze bell cast in Germany bearing the inscription Laudate Dominum, Praise the Lord. In the spring of 1834, Sister Margaret Clare, an Irish nun affiliated with the Sisters of Mercy, arrived to oversee the newly established orphanage. She appeared to be around 40, her hair already streaked with gray, and her hands were rough and worn from a lifetime of service. People who encountered her spoke of her compassionate eyes. Though her lips rarely curved into a smile, she carried herself with the calm, commanding presence of someone long accustomed to caring for society's forgotten children. Alongside her came two younger nuns, Sister Bernadette and Sister Catherine, both in their 20s and full of fervor for what they believed would be a righteous mission. On June 15, 1834, the orphanage opened with great fanfare. Almost every resident of the small town gathered for the inauguration. Both Protestant and Catholic families stood side by side, as Father Kellerman delivered a fiery sermon about the sacred duty of tending to the vulnerable. Sister Margaret Clare stood quietly beside him, hands clasped in solemn prayer, her expression composed and resolute. Within days, the first orphans arrived. Among them were siblings left parentless by a tragic factory explosion, a girl abandoned by a wandering entertainer, and streetwise boys plucked from the alleys of Philadelphia. The town's Catholic community embraced the orphanage wholeheartedly, organizing fundraisers, donating supplies, and volunteering time to support the cause. Even some Protestant families, stirred by the growing need, stepped forward to contribute. Yet from the outset, murmurs of unease trickled through the community. The orphanage enforced a rigid sense of order, and the children, when glimpsed outside, lacked the spontaneous joy expected of youth. Their movements were stiff and synchronized, more like cadets than children at play. The bell, once a symbol of devotion, rang with unsettling frequency, its heavy toll echoing day and night. Townspeople soon grew weary of the relentless sound that shattered their sleep. Merchants making deliveries to the institution noticed how strangely silent and pale the children were. Always under the watchful eyes of the nuns, the children seemed to carry an air of fear. When locals asked to visit or observe the facility, Father Kellerman would gently but firmly deny them, claiming that the children required a strict, distraction-free environment to cultivate strong moral values. Despite growing whispers, the orphanage maintained a respected status during its first year. Still, hints of something being wrong emerged. Dr. Thomas Whitmore, the town's only physician, remarked in his journal that he had never once been called to treat any child from the orphanage, an oddity given that he attended nearly every child elsewhere in town. When he voiced this concern to Father Kellerman, the priest explained that Sister Margaret Clare was well versed in medicine and fully capable of handling all medical concerns within the orphanage. As winter settled over the town later that year, townsfolk began noticing odd discrepancies in the orphanage's child population. A child seen one week might be absent the next, never to be spotted again. When questioned, Sister Margaret would respond with calm assurances that the children had been placed in homes outside the area, guided by God's will. It seemed a plausible explanation, at least at first, but in truth, something far darker had taken root behind the orphanage walls. The bell continued to ring at all hours. The children remained gaunt and unnaturally quiet, and Father Kellerman's sermons took on increasingly grim tones, focusing on themes of suffering, unwavering obedience, and spiritual cleansing. Unbeknownst to the town, Father Kellerman had brought more than religious conviction from his years in Bavaria. He had embraced certain arcane Catholic traditions, rituals, officially denounced by the Church centuries ago. He believed these ancient practices were essential not only for redeeming the souls of the orphan children, but for the salvation of the entire town. Inside his private quarters, he kept a series of leather-bound journals written in Latin. These recorded what he described as sanctified purgation, a divine duty he believed he was commanded to carry out. Thus began nearly 2 decades of hidden darkness. The nightmare would remain buried until long after the final child vanished from the Santa Eulalia orphanage. But the first real crack in the facade came on a harsh January morning in 1835, when Timothy Fletcher, the town's trusted delivery boy, arrived with a wagon full of firewood and canned goods. What he saw that day would leave a mark on his soul he would never shake. For 60 years, Timothy kept the secret buried deep inside him, never speaking of what he saw until the final days of his life, when the memory clawed its way back through the fog of time. That winter morning in 1887 had started like any other. Timothy had been delivering goods to the orphanage for months, always under the same instructions: unload the supplies at the back entrance, ring the bell once, and wait. Sister Bernadette would usually appear, sign the delivery slip without a smile or greeting, and vanish inside again. The routine was sterile, mechanical, but that morning, the frost had taken hold of the lock on the service door. As he stood there waiting in the biting cold, Timothy heard faint crying from somewhere within the building. It wasn't the sound of a single child, it was a chorus of soft weeping, fragile and desperate, echoing from deep within the stone walls. Unease prickled down his spine. Driven by concern, he walked around to the front of the building. To his surprise, the main doors were slightly ajar. The moment he stepped inside, the crying grew louder, interwoven now with a woman's voice speaking in an unfamiliar tongue. The air inside the orphanage was thick with the scent of burning wax, but beneath it lingered a sharper, stranger odor, something that reminded him of hospitals or medicine gone foul. The sounds led him toward the chapel. Its doors were not entirely closed, and through the narrow opening, he caught sight of a strange ritual unfolding. At the altar stood Sister Margaret Clare, her back rigid, arms lifted as she chanted in Latin. Clutching a small bundle swathed in white cloth, a circle of children surrounded her, kneeling so low their foreheads nearly brushed the cold stone floor. Not a single one moved or made a sound, yet their torn garments and gaunt, shaking bodies spoke volumes. Their silence screamed. It was the bundle in Sister Margaret Clare's arms that truly unsettled him. At first, he thought it was a relic or wrapped statue, but then it shifted slightly. Something inside it was alive. The realization struck him like ice in his veins. Before he could move, a voice sliced through the silence. Who dares interrupt sacred labor? He turned, startled, and found Sister Bernadette glaring at him. Her face twisted with fury, her usual calm demeanor nowhere to be found. Her habit was disheveled, and her hands, trembling at her sides, were stained with something dark and sticky that Timothy instinctively knew wasn't ink. I was just making the delivery, Timothy stuttered, retreating. The back door wouldn't open. I heard. There's no crying here, Sister Bernadette interrupted, her voice low and terrifyingly composed. Only prayer, only purification. She stepped closer. The metallic tang of her breath made his stomach twist. You will leave. You will forget. This work is not for the understanding of men like you. When he turned to go, her hand shot out and latched onto his wrist. The strength in her grip stunned him. She leaned in, her voice a whisper laced with menace. Swear it, on your mother's grave. Swear you'll never speak of this again. I swear. Timothy choked, and just like that, her fingers released him. He fled the orphanage, stumbling through snowdrifts, never once looking back. The cart and supplies remained where he'd left them. That night, his mother found him sitting motionless in the hayloft of their barn, eyes blank and wide with fear. When she pressed him, all he would say was that he didn't want to go back to the orphanage. She thought perhaps the nuns had frightened him with their stern manners. She decided that his older brother would take over the deliveries from then on. But it wasn't fear of discipline that haunted Timothy. It was the memory of those children, silent, still, skeletal. It was the feeling in the chapel, thick and cold, as if something unholy had seeped into the stones. And it was the way Sister Margaret Clare had cradled that bundle, not like it was fragile, but like it was dangerous. The next day, Father Kellerman made an unexpected visit to the Fletcher home. He spoke alone with Timothy for nearly an hour. No one ever learned what was said during that conversation, but afterward, Timothy's nightmares began. They came often and with terrible intensity, forcing screams from his throat. In the middle of the night, his speech faltered, and for months, he could barely get a sentence out without stuttering. His mother, a devout Lutheran, tried to soothe him with reassurances that Catholics practiced their religion differently. But Timothy would only shake his head, his voice trembling as he whispered, "That wasn't worship, Mama. That was something else." When asked to elaborate on his unsettling experiences, Timothy would simply go quiet, refusing to utter another word. Eventually, the task of delivering goods to the orphanage fell to his brother, Marcus, but soon Marcus began to notice oddities. He observed that the number of children seen through the windows seemed to fluctuate inexplicably. From week to week, at times, he heard faint singing echoing from beneath the floorboards. Strange, since Sister Margaret Clare had firmly stated the building had no basement at all. More troubling were the small, abandoned items Marcus began to find scattered across the orphanage grounds: a single child's shoe, a ragged piece of fabric, a small wooden cross, clearly carved to resemble a toy. When Marcus brought these things to Sister Bernadette's attention, she would quickly collect them and casually dismiss his concerns, insisting that children often misplaced their belongings. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The items never seemed to belong to any of the children he glimpsed through the windows. The clothing styles didn't match. The toys looked handmade and old, and there was an unexplainable sorrow in the silence of the place. Dr. Whitmore, the local physician and a man known for his keen eye and thoughtful nature, began to take notice of the strange whispers that had begun to circulate about the orphanage. He began documenting accounts from delivery boys and the rare townsfolk who had reason to visit the place. What troubled him the most was the absolute lack of any medical requests. In his 3 decades of practicing medicine, he had never known a group of children, especially orphans, often arriving malnourished and sick, not to require at least periodic treatment. Out of concern, he offered his medical services to the orphanage at no cost. But his offer was declined. Father Kellerman gave a courteous but firm refusal, stating that the children were remarkably healthy and that Sister Margaret Clare was more than capable of tending to their minor ailments. Most people might have accepted that explanation, but not Dr. Whitmore. He knew how illness lingered, especially among children in poor circumstances, and he couldn't believe a group that size remained untouched by even the common cold. A chilling piece of the puzzle surfaced the following spring, in 1835, when a traveling merchant named Jacob Reinhardt came through Millbrook with a troubling account. He claimed that during his journey through a town some 50 miles east, he had encountered a young girl begging on a street corner. She was about 10 years old. With haunted eyes and fresh scars on her arms, she told him in hushed, broken sentences that she had escaped from a place she described as where the bell never stops ringing. When Reinhardt gently asked her to explain, the girl grew frantic and ran off, but not before uttering one final name: Santa Eulalia. As a Catholic, Reinhardt was deeply unsettled. The way she had spoken, so afraid, so certain, lingered with him. Troubled, he made it a point to learn more about the orphanage in Millbrook. What he discovered only deepened the sense that something terrible was being hidden behind its stone walls and solemn prayers. Santa Eulalia was often spoken of as a model of faith and charity, a beacon of God's work in the world. Yet whenever the townsfolk of Millbrook praised the orphanage, there was a note of uncertainty in their voices, as if they were trying harder to reassure themselves than convince anyone else. The merchant Reinhardt, a traveling trader with a keen eye for truth, picked up on this unease. His curiosity about the orphanage led to whispered conversations and guarded glances. It wasn't long before Father Kellerman, the imposing priest who oversaw the orphanage's spiritual affairs, sought him out. That evening, Kellerman appeared unannounced at the inn where Reinhardt was staying. No one knows what exactly was said behind the closed door of Reinhardt's room, but the innkeeper later swore he heard voices raised in anger, threats. Even by sunrise, the merchant had packed his things and was gone, abandoning the business dealings he had originally come to complete. He never returned to Millbrook. Reinhardt's departure became the first in a troubling sequence. Anyone who took too keen an interest in the orphanage or asked too many probing questions would invariably receive a personal visit from Father Kellerman. Afterward, they would either fall disturbingly silent or leave town without explanation. It was as if the priest had an unnatural ability to know who was speaking and what was being said about Santa Eulalia. Soon, something even stranger began. The bronze bell in the orphanage's tower, once used only to mark mealtimes and daily prayers, started ringing at increasingly erratic hours: midnight, 3 in the morning, and sometimes for hours during the day. The bell tolled without pause. When townspeople complained about the constant clanging disrupting their sleep, Father Kellerman offered a pious explanation that the bell was being used to sanctify holy hours of contemplation. But not everyone was convinced. Dr. Whitmore, a physician who had studied the effects of psychological stress during his training, began to notice a disturbing pattern. The timing of the bell's ringing seemed intentionally designed to disrupt sleep and disorient those within hearing range. He theorized that the noise wasn't meant to inspire prayer at all. It was being used to keep the children, and perhaps even the staff, in a perpetual state of mental exhaustion. What he couldn't understand, however, was why the unease surrounding the orphanage turned to alarm during the summer of 1835. That was when 8-year-old Anna Dietrich vanished without a trace. She had been left at the orphanage by her aunt, Elizabeth Hoffman, after the child's parents succumbed to a cholera outbreak. Mrs. Hoffman had been promised she could visit monthly, but when she arrived for her second visit, she was informed that Anna had already been adopted by a family in Baltimore. When she asked for the names or contact details of the adoptive family, she was told their privacy was sacred. No documentation would be shared. Suspicious and increasingly frantic, Mrs. Hoffman demanded proof of the adoption. Sister Margaret Clare, the orphanage's stern matron, insisted the documents were private church records and could not be revealed. Unwilling to accept this, Mrs. Hoffman tried to question the other children, but they were too frightened to speak openly. When they did speak, it was only in hushed, broken whispers. They said Anna had gone to the quiet place and prayed they wouldn't be sent there too. When Mrs. Hoffman pressed further, she was forcibly removed from the property by 2 large men whom Father Kellerman introduced as defenders of the church's sanctity. Witnesses watched her being led away, shouting her niece's name. She never returned to Millbrook, but spent the remainder of her life writing letters to religious authorities, pleading for someone to investigate what had happened inside those walls. By the end of that year, the signs were undeniable to anyone with eyes to see. Children were brought to Santa Eulalia, but few were ever seen again. Those who remained grew gaunt and pale. Their faces became blank, their movements lethargic. The once warm and protective facade of the orphanage had given way to something far colder, something calculated. Father Kellerman's sermons took on a grim tone, filled with talk of sacrifice, divine obedience, and the necessity of spiritual cleansing. And the bell never stopped ringing. In the final months of 1835, even those who had tried to ignore the unease felt the change. The orphanage building itself seemed to exude a kind of dark presence. Candlelight flickered behind the tall windows throughout the night, and odd shadows drifted past the glass in motions that didn't match the calm rhythms of prayer or reading. There was an energy there, unsettling, unnatural. Sister Catherine, the youngest of the 3 nuns who lived at Santa Eulalia, began to deteriorate in plain view. On her rare trips into town, she was barely recognizable. Her hands trembled violently, and she would recoil from sudden sounds or movements. Her once bright demeanor had vanished, replaced by a vacant, haunted expression. Her habit, once neat and pressed, now hung loosely from a body that had lost too much weight. She had the look of someone unraveling. The town had once believed it was home to a place of hope and holiness, but now, even the most devout began to wonder if they were witnessing something unholy, something deliberately hidden behind rosaries and stained glass. With 93 children having passed through the orphanage's doors, the question remained, would anyone uncover the truth before it was too late? Asterisk, asterisk. Like a burial shroud draped over truth, a sense of dread settled around the orphanage. Dr. Whitmore, whose initial clinical curiosity had long since deepened into genuine concern, began to keep meticulous records in his private journal. Sister Catherine, he wrote, shows signs I've only observed in veterans of long campaigns and emotional and physical depletion, reminiscent of soldiers broken by endless battle. The troubling question is what conflict rages inside those orphanage walls. Hints of the answer trickled in, pieced together from Sister Catherine's hushed, fragmented confessions during rare visits into town. To Mary Patterson, the baker's wife, she once murmured, "The children, they try so hard, but nothing is ever enough, not for her." When Mary gently asked for clarification, Sister Catherine's eyes welled with tears. Sister Margaret Clare says pain cleanses the soul, But I don't think we're purifying anything. I think we're destroying them. The picture that began to emerge was one of relentless spiritual cruelty disguised as religious duty. The source of this torment appeared to be Father Kellerman's so-called sacred method, a doctrine he claimed had roots in ancient Catholicism, but which was in truth a warped amalgamation of monastic punishment. And his growing fascination with child martyrdom. He preached that children could become holy vessels by enduring suffering, and to that end, subjected them to what he called graduated trials of faith. These trials began with starvation-level fasting and evolved into acts of physical punishment, eventually leading to something referred to only in whispers, the final purification. Sister Catherine's vague recollections hinted that this final stage was something far more horrifying than prayer or repentance. At the heart of this system stood the orphanage's bronze bell, once a symbol of divine call, now twisted into an instrument of control. Its erratic tolling created a constant tension among the children, sometimes ringing without pause, other times remaining silent for hours. Over time, the bell trained them to respond instantly to sound, like conditioned animals desperate to avoid punishment or gain a moment of stillness. Samuel Crane, a merchant who had long delivered goods to the orphanage, began to notice strange inconsistencies. The quantity of food ordered seemed insufficient to feed the number of children he believed resided there. Moreover, the requested items suggested a Spartan, almost punitive diet. When he raised his concerns, Sister Bernadette replied, "The children are learning to draw nourishment from prayer, not from the flesh." Even more disturbing were the shipments, arriving from Philadelphia, quantities of medical supplies that didn't belong in a children's home. Among them were vials of laudanum, surgical kits, and chemicals that Dr. Whitmore recognized as embalming agents. When he asked about these, the explanation given was that Sister Margaret Clare was conducting church-sanctioned medical research. But that claim crumbled when inquiries into her past began. Contrary to her claims of Irish convent training, Sister Margaret Clare had been expelled from a religious order in France. Official records labeled her practice as theologically dangerous, and her methods a threat to the well-being of children. She had traveled to America under a false name and somehow convinced Father Kellerman of her qualifications as a spiritual guide and healer. What she truly believed bordered on heresy. According to her twisted theology, children were the purest, vessels of divine grace, and could be brought closer to God through systematic suffering. Those who endured the ordeal became, in her eyes, spiritually transcendent. Those who died were celebrated as martyrs, allegedly buried in a secret sanctified space beneath the orphanage. Timothy Fletcher, a young delivery boy who once inadvertently glimpsed a strange ritual in the chapel, began experiencing vivid, haunting dreams. These dreams felt less like figments of imagination and more like repressed memories surfacing. In them, he saw rows of silent children, their bodies marked with symbols, forced to ingest potions that made them violently ill. He dreamed of a hidden chamber beneath the chapel, where small wooden crosses were etched with names and dates, and where the scent of fresh soil mingled with something sickly sweet and deeply unsettling. Timothy began to wonder if his mind had shielded him from the worst of what he'd seen, burying trauma too terrible to face consciously. The first tangible proof of the orphanage's horrors came in the spring of 1836, when a roof repair brought a worker named Patrick O'Brien to the bell tower. A quiet, observant Irish immigrant familiar with the reverence due in holy spaces, O'Brien used an internal stairwell that offered unexpected views into several restricted areas of the building. During his week of repairs, O'Brien witnessed rituals that chilled him. From a high window overlooking a dormitory, he saw Sister Margaret Clare lead children into a bizarre morning rite. They were made to kneel naked on icy wooden floors, while she scrutinized their bodies, claiming to search for spiritual blemishes. Any sign of bruising, illness, or even ordinary childhood behavior was punished. The marked children were taken away to a place O'Brien never saw them return from. One afternoon, curiosity led him to a ground-level window partially obscured by brush. It looked into the building's supposedly non-existent basement. What he saw there defied reason. The room resembled a crude medical clinic, complete with a heavy wooden table, surgical tools, and glass jars filled with preserved organs that looked heartbreakingly human. O'Brien left the orphanage with a sickness in his soul that never truly lifted. And as word of his findings spread, so too did the chilling realization that what happened within the walls of the orphanage wasn't misguided faith, it was a sanctified nightmare. The walls were lined with intricate anatomical drawings, disturbingly specific illustrations of children's internal organs. Patrick O'Brien, a devout Catholic who had fled persecution in his homeland for a new beginning in America, was horrified by what he discovered within the stone walls of Santa Elia Orphanage. What he initially hoped was a charitable sanctuary gradually unraveled before his eyes into something far darker. He wrestled with whether to report the disturbing signs he had encountered, knowing full well that doing so could bring unwanted scrutiny and even danger to the already vulnerable Catholic community. In Millbrook, that choice was torn from him when, on his final day working there, he stumbled upon something that would change him forever. While adjusting the bell's internal mechanism in the orphanage tower, he heard a faint but chilling hymn echoing from below. Drawn by the sound, he followed it through a disused corridor until he came across a hidden door leading to an underground room. There, in dim candlelight, he witnessed what could only be described as a grotesque and blasphemous ceremony. Sister Margaret Clare stood beside a narrow wooden table, her hands bloodied but steady, as she murmured Latin verses. Upon the table lay a frail boy, perhaps 7 years old, whose small body had been carved with precise symbols that looked more like surgical incisions than religious markings. The boy appeared dazed, his wide eyes fluttering as if caught between consciousness and oblivion. A cloth soaked with laudanum was pressed to his nose, dulling his pain but keeping him alive and eerily euphoric. Sister Margaret Clare worked with a surgeon's calmness, explaining aloud, perhaps for her own benefit, that she was removing what she referred to as the physical anchors that prevented true spiritual transcendence. That it took O'Brien a moment to process what he was seeing. The wounds weren't fresh, some were old, partially healed. This child had endured multiple sessions. As the nun continued her hymn, calling this moment one of sacred beauty, O'Brien broke from his trance, lunged forward, and pulled the child from the table. The nun neither screamed nor resisted. Instead, she extended a blood-stained hand toward the boy and calmly stated that his death would mark his ultimate purification, that he was being granted a martyr's gift. O'Brien ran, cradling the boy against his chest, but he was too late. The child's final breaths came in whispered Latin, a prayer Sister Margaret had taught him for this moment. He died in O'Brien's arms just steps away from Dr. Whitmore's clinic. That death marked the beginning of the orphanage's unraveling, but it would take over a decade for the truth to surface in full. O'Brien's actions that day sparked a chain reaction that threatened to tear apart the carefully constructed illusion Santa Elia had presented for years. Dr. Whitmore, shaken by the boy's condition, began documenting his findings in detail. His examination uncovered not just fresh trauma, but signs of prolonged and calculated torture, starvation, ritualistic mutilation, and the use of hallucinogens to manipulate the child's perceptions. The scarring patterns on the internal organs were not random. They resembled experimental procedures done with anatomical knowledge, far beyond what was common for someone in Sister Margaret's position. The implication was clear. Someone had been using the orphanage as a front for systematic, ritualistic experiments on children under the guise of spiritual purification. Whitmore wasted no time. He prepared copies of his findings and sent them to medical professionals in major cities, ensuring the evidence couldn't be quietly erased. He gave O'Brien a certified copy of the report as well, hoping it might help pursue justice. But neither man was naive. The reach of Santa Elia stretched far beyond the small town. Days later, representatives from the archdiocese arrived unannounced, armed with official-looking papers branding O'Brien a convicted criminal back in Ireland. The documents were forged, but convincing. They painted O'Brien as a thief and conman with a vendetta against the church. It was enough for the local sheriff, already pressured by influential Catholic families to act. He issued a warrant for O'Brien's arrest on charges of theft, fraud, and making false claims against a religious institution. O'Brien didn't wait to be taken. Before vanishing from Millbrook, he shared everything he knew with a small circle of trusted people. Among them was Timothy Fletcher, who had finally uncovered the reason for the orphanage's eerie silence and the strange behavior of those involved. The truth, once exposed, would shatter reputations and end lives, but for O'Brien, survival came first. The battle against Santa Ulia had begun, but it would be many years before its darkest secrets came fully to light. Despite his fear, Timothy eventually found the courage to speak about what he had seen inside the chapel. At the orphanage, his account, along with that of O'Brien, who had independently witnessed similar horrors, formed a deeply unsettling but consistent picture that could no longer be dismissed as imagination or malice. At first, Timothy's mother, Mrs. Fletcher, struggled to accept what her son was saying, but O'Brien's vivid, corroborating testimony made her reconsider. It became clear to her that Timothy's nightmares and behavioral changes weren't rooted in fantasy. They were symptoms of real trauma brought on by something truly horrific. Once she understood the depth of what had happened, Mrs. Fletcher took action. Quietly and methodically, she began compiling information about the orphanage. She tracked every child who had entered its care, noted contradictions in the nuns' stories, and recorded the bizarre incidents locals had spoken about for years. As her investigation deepened, it revealed unsettling patterns. The number of children allegedly adopted far exceeded what would be expected under normal circumstances. When she tried to verify the adoptive families, none could be found. Her husband's contacts in the local business community helped her acquire the orphanage's supply orders and financial documents. They showed that the institution was ordering provisions for far fewer children than it claimed to house. What she discovered next chilled her to the bone. Through a contact in the postal service, she gained access to private letters exchanged between Sister Margaret Clare and various individuals in Europe. These letters exposed the orphanage as part of a broader network of radical religious fanatics. The correspondents believed in the spiritual power of child martyrdom. Sister Margaret Clare wrote in meticulous detail about what she referred to as the purification of innocent souls. She described experimental techniques combining drugs, surgery, and psychological manipulation designed to push children into states of religious rapture before death, believing this would secure their place in heaven and transform them into heavenly intercessors. According to the letters, 37 children had been purified within the first 2 years of the orphanage's operation. The plan was to expand this process to other institutions. Even more shocking was the revelation that Father Kellerman wasn't just turning a blind eye. He had crafted the theological framework for these atrocities. His writings twisted Catholic doctrines about innocence and salvation into a justification for murder. He believed that killing a child before they could be corrupted by the world was the ultimate act of mercy. In his eyes, he was following in the footsteps of Abraham, offering innocent souls to God for the benefit of mankind. Funding for the orphanage came from wealthy Catholic donors who believed they were supporting a compassionate mission. Unbeknownst to them, their money was being spent on sedatives, surgical tools, and the materials required to carry out ritualistic killings disguised as acts of divine mercy. As Mrs. Fletcher put the pieces together, the scale of the horror became apparent. The institution hadn't been rescuing children, it had been systematically eliminating them under the guise of spiritual salvation. The 93 children who had disappeared weren't placed with families or sent to better facilities. They had been killed in secret ceremonies conducted by those who believed their deaths served a higher purpose. Even more troubling was the support system behind the crimes. The orphanage wasn't a lone actor. It operated with the assistance of influential donors, compromised clergy, and even government officials who had been bribed or intimidated into silence. Although Mrs. Fletcher had collected powerful evidence, she knew it would never survive if handed to local authorities. The same people who had discredited Dr. Whitmore and driven O'Brien from town would ensure her silence. Everything changed in the winter of 1837, when a journalist named Edward Harrington arrived in Millbrook, working for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Harrington had a reputation for fearlessly exposing corruption within religious institutions. He had been tipped off by several sources, including Dr. Whitmore, who had managed to pass word of the orphanage's activities despite repeated efforts to suppress him. Harrington approached the situation with caution and precision, rather than confronting Kellerman or trying to enter the orphanage directly. He focused on the paper trail, public records, staff histories, and financial transactions. What he uncovered only deepened the sense of horror. Records revealed that Father Kellerman had been expelled from his previous post in Bavaria for dangerous theological practices and had relocated to the U.S. under suspicious circumstances. Even more startling was the truth about Sister Margaret Claire. She wasn't a nun at all, but a disgraced medical student from Paris who had been expelled for illegal experiments on human cadavers. She had assumed the identity of a deceased nun and forged her way into religious institutions across Europe before arriving in America. Further digging uncovered that large, untraceable funds were being funneled through the orphanage money that was spent on items unrelated to child care. This suggested a far-reaching and highly organized operation. As Harrington's investigation made progress, anonymous threats began to surface. At first, they were subtle. Notes slipped under his door, vague warnings whispered in the streets. Then came the violence. He was brutally attacked near his hotel, a clear message to abandon the case. But rather than deter him, the assault only convinced him that he was closer to uncovering something monstrous. Harrington joined forces with Mrs. Fletcher, and together they compiled a detailed report outlining everything: the correspondence between Sister Claire and her European associates, the financial discrepancies, the real identities of the orphanage's staff, and the evidence of ritualistic murders. The dossier they created painted a horrifying picture, not only of the atrocities committed at Santa Eulalia, but of the wider system that enabled them. Their work was not just an expose of a single institution's crimes, but a roadmap revealing how a hidden network of extremism, corruption, and blind faith had taken root under the banner of charity. The truth, once fully revealed, could no longer be ignored. ***. The case against Santa Eulalia Orphanage grew stronger with every shred of evidence unearthed. Financial trails linked illicit funds directly to the institution, while Dr. Whitmore's medical examination of a slain child offered undeniable physical proof of abuse. Multiple eyewitnesses had come forward, detailing suspicious goings-on at the orphanage. But the most damning material came in the form of a carefully compiled dossier and exhaustive timeline exposing how anyone who had tried to shed light on the truth had met an untimely end. It pointed to a pattern, a web of intimidation, silencing, and unexplained deaths. One such victim was Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, who had persistently demanded answers about her missing niece. Weeks later, she was found dead in a Baltimore hotel room under circumstances that authorities never fully explained. Reaching this point in the investigation meant confronting horrific truths buried deep within the shadows of America's past. For those with the strength to face such darkness, the revelations were just beginning. The horror at Santa Eulalia was not an isolated case, but a window into a far more widespread conspiracy. The revelations would go on to challenge long-held beliefs about religious institutions. During the 19th century, the turning point came in the bitter cold of 1838, when Harrington and Mrs. Fletcher finally secured the evidence needed to confirm that Santa Eulalia was the site of organized child killings. Surprisingly, this final piece came from someone within the institution itself. Sister Catherine, the youngest nun in the orphanage, had been growing visibly unstable since O'Brien's narrow escape. Racked with guilt and haunted by what she had seen and done, she reached out to Mrs. Fletcher through a trusted contact, offering to reveal everything. Over several clandestine meetings, Sister Catherine gave a confession so graphic and heartbreaking that even Harrington, no stranger to the atrocities of institutional abuse, had difficulty maintaining his composure. She spoke in vivid detail about how children were singled out for what the orphanage leaders called purification. According to her, the selection process was based on a warped belief system propagated by Sister Margaret Claire. Children who were inquisitive, independent, disobedient, or physically frail were deemed spiritually flawed and targeted for early purification. The ceremonies took place in hidden chambers beneath the orphanage rooms. O'Brien had only partially discovered These soundproofed spaces were interconnected by tunnels and could be accessed through secret doors, known only to Sister Margaret Clare and Father Kellerman. The children chosen for purification were told they had been selected for a divine purpose to become spiritual intercessors who would pray on behalf of the living from the afterlife. The process began with weeks of deliberate starvation and sleeplessness. As their bodies weakened, they were given hallucinogenic substances that induced religious visions and feelings of divine euphoria. This manipulation was reinforced with sacred songs and images depicting the heavenly reward that awaited them. The children, under the illusion of sanctity, began to believe they had been truly chosen. Eventually came the final ritual, referred to by Sister Margaret Clare as the sacred surgery. It involved grotesque and drawn-out mutilations, always carried out while the children remained semi-conscious and drugged. The pain was part of the ritual. Sister Margaret Clare believed that the greater the child's suffering, the more spiritually potent their soul would become in the afterlife. As Sister Catherine recounted these acts, she struggled to maintain her composure, and so did Harrington. She described scenes that would leave anyone shattered, Sister Margaret singing soft hymns as she carved elaborate symbols into small, trembling bodies, whispering gentle reassurances while performing unspeakable acts, holding the children's hands as they lay dying, broken and confused, yet still trying to pray. After death, the bodies were carried to a mass grave dug beneath the chapel, the same grave that would be discovered decades later, marked by wooden crosses bearing the names and dates of each lost child. These markers, Sister Catherine said, were not placed there out of mourning, but as a recorded grim tally of the purified, inscribed by the very hand that ended their lives. Catherine's most horrifying revelation concerned the vast reach of the conspiracy behind the crimes. She disclosed that Father Kellerman had maintained frequent contact with high-ranking church officials in Philadelphia, who were not only aware of the events at the orphanage, but had actively guided them. These officials, as Catherine explained, viewed the atrocities as a form of sacred experimentation. They believed that by examining the spiritual effects of intense human suffering, they could pioneer new methods of soul purification, ultimately benefiting the church at large. This twisted ideology wasn't limited to clergy. Several affluent Catholic families had unknowingly helped bankroll the operation, having been led to believe their donations were supporting a sensitive missionary effort, perhaps to convert Native Americans or engage in remote acts of religious outreach. These generous families provided the financial support used to purchase drugs, surgical tools, and other equipment essential to the orphanage's dark activities. Even more disturbing was Catherine's disclosure that Santa Ulia had served as a model training center for similar operations. She recounted sessions where Sister Margaret Clare shared her practices with visitors from out of state. The names and locations she provided painted a grim picture. A network of similar institutions, possibly functioning across the country. If her testimony was accurate, Santa Ulia was not an isolated case, but part of a wide-reaching, systematic campaign of child sacrifice, conducted with the approval or at least the willful blindness of both ecclesiastical and lay elites. The full scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Edward Harrington understood that bringing Catherine's revelations to light would demand extreme caution. The powers he was up against were far more formidable than he had first imagined. To protect the story, he arranged for it to be published simultaneously by multiple newspapers in various cities, preventing the conspiracy from shutting it down by silencing a single outlet. But even with these precautions, the danger escalated quickly. Harrington's hotel room was searched in his absence. His secured notes vanished, and anonymous threats became more pointed and personal. He was certain now that his life was in jeopardy. The tension climaxed when Sister Catherine missed a meeting scheduled with Harrington and Mrs. Fletcher. Concerned, they went to the orphanage to check on her. The staff claimed she had been transferred for mental health treatment, citing a supposed psychological breakdown. The truth, however, was far more sinister. Catherine had been discovered by Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare. Realizing that she was leaking information, they subjected her to the same brutal purification rituals inflicted on the children. Her death was staged to resemble a suicide driven by spiritual despair. Catherine's murder was the turning point. The circumstances surrounding her death were too convenient, too suspicious. It served as damning proof that those behind the orphanage were willing to kill to protect their secrets. Her testimony, now paired with the evidence of her fate, gave Harrington the final leverage he needed. But he knew the consequences of publishing the story could be catastrophic. The conspiracy, as he had now confirmed, extended to the highest levels of church and state. These were individuals with the means to bury evidence, frighten or eliminate witnesses, and manipulate public perception. Still, Harrington pressed on. The question was no longer simply about justice for the children. It was about defending the principles of justice itself. On March 15, 1839, his expose was released in newspapers across 5 states. Its title, The Angels of Santa Ulia, introduced readers to a harrowing account of organized, institutionalized child murder in Pennsylvania. The story could not be silenced. It ignited immediate outrage and national attention. The evidence presented was so thorough and irrefutable that it forced federal investigators to act and led to emergency congressional hearings on church corruption. The public response was swift and furious. Crowds gathered outside the gates of Santa Ulia, demanding explanations about the fate of children who were said to have been adopted, but had never been seen again. Panic spread among the perpetrators. Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare attempted to flee in the night, but were captured by federal agents dispatched to secure the premises and prevent the destruction of records. The subsequent search of the orphanage uncovered horrors even worse than what Catherine had described. Secret underground rooms held not only surgical devices and chemical substances, but the investigators uncovered an appalling archive, meticulous records detailing the fate of every murdered child. These files included hand-drawn illustrations of the ritualistic mutilations inflicted upon the victims, along with transcripts of their final, agonized words. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a private journal belonging to Sister Margaret Clare. Written in a cryptic blend of Latin and German, the journal exposed the depth of her delusions. She described her actions not as crimes, but as a sacred experiment and effort to identify the precise combination of suffering, psychological manipulation, and chemical inducement required for a soul to achieve instant sanctification. In her writings, Sister Margaret documented the effects of various tortures and drug regimens on the children's behavior in their last moments, noting their reactions with clinical detachment. She claimed that after death, the children would appear to her in divine visions smiling, thanking her for their purification and offering instructions for future rituals. She believed she was raising an army of sanctified children who would one day act as holy emissaries, interceding with God to usher in a global era of spiritual renewal. The theological underpinnings of these horrors were further clarified by Father Kellerman's confession, which was obtained under pressure from federal investigators. He admitted that his ideology had been shaped during his theological studies in Bavaria, where he had come across obscure medieval texts recounting similar child sacrifices practiced by heretical sects. He rationalized these teachings, concluding that the Church's public condemnation of such acts had more to do with political expediency than any real doctrinal opposition. His testimony also revealed the existence of a broad support network that enabled the orphanage's continued operation. This included members of the clergy, affluent benefactors, and even government officials, individuals who knowingly facilitated or ignored the abuse. The breadth of complicity was staggering, and the fallout was swift. Prominent resignations followed, along with criminal prosecutions and sweeping institutional reforms. But nothing prepared the investigators for what lay beneath the orphanage chapel. A mass grave was unearthed, containing the remains of 93 children. Each skeleton bore signs of systematic, prolonged torture. It was evident the methods had been designed to keep the victims alive for as long as possible while inflicting maximum suffering. Among the bones, workers found wooden crosses, each carefully inscribed with the name of a child and the date of their so-called purification. A grim testament erected by Sister Margaret herself. Forensic analysis of the grave supported everything Sister Catherine had testified to earlier. The pattern and precision of injuries revealed that someone with medical training and complete emotional detachment had orchestrated the suffering. But even more chilling was what they found. In a hidden chamber deep within the orphanage, inside, authorities discovered Sister Margaret Clare's long-term blueprint, maps outlining future orphanage, locations across the American frontier, letters exchanged with European allies who shared her radical ideology, and detailed budgets for what she described as the systematic purification of society's discarded children. Her vision was expansive. Santa Ulia was only the beginning. She intended to create a widespread network of institutions, each processing thousands of children annually, to forge the largest congregation of sanctified martyrs in history. As news of the investigation spread, survivors began to emerge. Children who had escaped or been rescued before falling victim to the full extent of the orphanage's horrors. Now adults, they offered first-hand accounts that filled in critical gaps and confirmed the psychological cruelty embedded in daily life at the institution. These were not merely places of abuse. They were designed to completely break down a child's sense of self, instilling in them the belief that death was a reward. One such survivor, Thomas Brennan, managed to flee the orphanage in 1840 at age 12. He recounted how the children were made to take part in mock funeral ceremonies for their peers, singing hymns of joy and envy as others were led away to be killed. He remembered Sister Margaret praising the murdered children as lucky, urging the others to aspire to their fate. Another survivor, Mary O'Sullivan, had been pulled from the orphanage by watchful relatives. She described forced starvation, the use of sedatives to dull resistance, and the toxic competition among the children to earn the honor of being chosen for purification. She said the children were brainwashed into thinking their torment was a divine privilege. These testimonies painted a harrowing picture of the orphanage not just as a place of physical torment, but as a fusion of prison camp, experimental medical facility, and fanatical religious sect. Every element of the environment was tailored to dehumanize, dominate, and eventually destroy the children in the name of a higher cause. The legal proceedings that followed, centered on Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare, became one of the most infamous trials of the 19th century. The courtroom overflowed with journalists, citizens, and international observers. The evidence, both physical and testimonial, exposed a reality so grotesque that it forced societies around the world to re-examine the unchecked power of religious institutions. What began as a probe into an isolated orphanage evolved into a sweeping condemnation of systemic abuse, blind faith, and the horrifying extremes to which ideologues will go when left unchallenged. The evidence presented at trial was so overwhelming that both defendants were found guilty of numerous counts of murder and sentenced to death. Sister Margaret Clare remained defiant to the very end, claiming her actions were divinely inspired, and that the children she had killed were now among the holiest souls in heaven. Father Kellerman, in contrast, seemed to unravel mentally during the proceedings. At times, he said he had been misled by Sister Margaret Clare. At others, he insisted their deeds were guided by divine visions. The fallout from the exposure of the Santa Ulia conspiracy rippled far beyond the courtroom. It triggered congressional inquiries into the regulation of religious organizations and resulted in the introduction of new laws requiring government oversight of orphanages and institutions that cared for children. A nationwide conversation erupted about the risks posed by unchecked religious authority. Initially, the Catholic Church tried to dissociate itself from the scandal, but it eventually had to confront the uncomfortable truth that some of its leaders had aided or ignored the crimes. This admission led to sweeping reforms within the Church's leadership and new protocols to monitor faith-based institutions serving vulnerable communities. The orphanage itself was torn down in 1887, nearly 50 years after the horrors within. Its walls had come to light. The building had sat abandoned since 1839, its grim history making it unfit for any further use. Time and neglect reduced it to ruins, overtaken by nature. When the demolition crew cleared the last of the debris, they found dozens of handmade wooden crosses buried in the soil, each one representing a child who had once hoped for love and safety but instead met a brutal death at the hands of those claiming to serve a higher power. The conspiracy was found to stretch far beyond the orphanage's grounds. Ultimately, 23 individuals, including high-ranking clergy, affluent benefactors, and even public officials, were prosecuted for their roles in either committing or concealing the crimes. The trials produced thousands of pages of witness statements and records, providing a comprehensive account of how blind loyalty, institutional power, and fanatical belief merged into one of the most appalling crimes in American history. Dr. Whitmore, whose early concerns had sparked the investigation, spent his later years chronicling the psychological and forensic aspects of the case. His work became foundational in the field of criminal psychology and helped reshape investigative approaches to organized abuse. Edward Harrington, the journalist who had broken the story, became one of the country's most respected investigative reporters, dedicating his career to exposing abuses within powerful systems. He never forgot the lesson he learned from Santa Ulia: silence and indifference from ordinary people can allow the most monstrous acts to flourish. Mrs. Fletcher, the mother who refused to be silenced, became a driving force behind child protection reforms. She worked with lawmakers to implement stronger oversight of child care institutions and pushed for lasting legal protections to prevent future tragedies like Santa Ulia. The children who survived the orphanage carried deep scars. Some, like Thomas Brennan and Mario Sullivan, managed to heal and use their stories to help others. But many were never able to overcome the trauma. A number succumbed to psychological wounds that never closed, and some ended their own lives, haunted by memories that refused to fade. The impact of the Santa Ulia case reshaped how America approached the care of its most vulnerable citizens. It led to mandatory inspections of institutions, enforced reporting of suspected abuse, and gave authorities the power to remove children from harmful environments more swiftly. On a spiritual level, it forced religious communities to reckon with the danger of letting belief override humanity, and it sparked essential debates about where to draw the line between religious liberty and public accountability. Above all, the case proved that even the most powerful institutions can be held accountable when everyday people stand up and demand the truth. The unraveling of the conspiracy wasn't the work of a lone hero, but rather the result of many individuals, from construction workers and doctors to journalists and concerned families refusing to stay silent. For years after the building was razed, the land remained vacant. Locals avoided the area, believing it to be cursed or spiritually tainted. Whether that was due to supernatural forces or the heavy emotional weight of what had occurred, there was never clear. Then, in 1934, almost a century after the crimes were exposed, the town of Millbrook erected a memorial on the site. It featured a modest granite marker engraved with the names of all 93 victims and was surrounded by a quiet garden where visitors could pay their respects. The inscription on the stone served as a stark warning in memory of 93 innocent souls whose lives were taken by those who claimed to serve God. May their deaths remind us never to allow faith to justify cruelty and to remain vigilant in protecting the vulnerable. Today, the events at Santa Ulia are studied in law schools, theological colleges, and psychology departments as a sobering example of how religious zealotry and institutional negligence can facilitate systematic abuse. The case continues to offer profound insights into the minds of both perpetrators and survivors. It stands as a permanent reminder that safeguarding children and other at-risk groups requires ongoing effort, not just from authorities, but from everyone. The children who died at Santa Ulia were failed not only by those who murdered them, but also by a society that preferred comfort over confrontation and silence over truth. The old bronze bell that once rang through the orphanage's tower was melted down after the building was demolished. The metal was used to forge a new bell for the town's Lutheran church. That bell only rings during traditional services and special events. Its clean, resonant chime now serves as a symbol of hope and healing for a community that learned through pain the cost of looking away. The tragedy of Santa Ulia teaches us that evil often wears the mask of righteousness, and that sacred institutions, when left unexamined, can become vessels for horrific cruelty. The 93 children who died there were not victims of the supernatural or of unknowable evil. They were lost because human beings chose willful ignorance, defended their status, and looked away from suffering in the name of religion. Do you believe everything about Santa Elia has truly come to light? Or could there be more buried secrets in the shadows of history? Share your thoughts on how society can better protect its most vulnerable members from harm disguised as faith. And if you found this story compelling, remember to follow for more revelations that confront the hidden darkness behind institutions once thought to be sacred. Only by confronting the past can we protect the future.